kind of an addition to what I had previously on my other YouTube channel. Um, this is basically an explanation about what the HL project is for global politics, what to expect, and a little bit about what you can do, and a little bit of strategy. So let's begin. The component for HL, you have an internal assessment, and the internal assessment component of your class is divided into separate sections. You have, number one, you have the engagement activity, and that's everything that SL and HL students do. That's the 2,000 word written report on an activity that you engage in based on a political issue. However, within HL, you have an additional internally assessed component of the course, which is the HL Extension Global Political Challenge presentation, and you have two of those to do. So you're going to have two video recorded oral presentations, 10-minute maximum, on two separate case studies on two separate political issues. And these topics come from a very specific focus point, which are the global political challenges. And we'll see those in a second. But please pay attention. The HL extension is 20% of your overall grade for the course, so they are pretty significant. And depending on how much time and effort you put into it, it's a great way to help your grade overall. It's very student driven, and it's a great way to explore a concept that's really of interest to you, utilizing global politics concepts and content. So I took this directly out of the subject guide. And like I said before, you have to do two separate 10-minute presentations as a requirement for the HL. And they have to be chosen from one of these 6 areas of study, the global political challenges. Please be aware that you can't double dip here. You have to choose 2 separate topic areas. So if I choose environment, I can't ever do an environment one for my second. I have to choose a separate one: poverty, health, identity, border security. And these are pretty broad areas of study. So they're actually kind of interesting for you because you can choose something that you haven't really thought about before in terms of health. There's a lot of topics you can choose from. But the one thing that I really stress for my students is that these need to be demonstrated to have global significance. On a separate video, I'll explain to you how to break down the components for the criteria or for the scoring of the HL extension project. And one of the things that is pretty important is that you can't treat the case study in isolation. If you only focus on the problem within a state and only talking about the state, you cannot score well on this on this project. You really need to demonstrate that this issue, this political issue that you identify, has global significance. Anyways, so a little bit later on in this video, I talk about the requirements for the 10-minute recording. And that's a maximum. You go over 10 and examiners are going to stop watching. The teacher will stop watching, and anything identified after 10 minutes is not going to be graded. So 10 minutes seems like a long time to talk, but in reality, it's actually not enough to do an in-depth analysis. Like sometimes you wish you can go further. So you really need to be concise and condense down some of the arguments that you make. This is also from the guide. This is kind of a visual representation of what the project looks like. Initially, you start out with kind of a brainstorming preparation phase, and that's typically what I do with my students. We start out with discussions, help them identify, clarify political issues, develop research questions, research case studies, and once you have all that together, then you can go further in researching your case study in terms of the major issue that's going on, how does it demonstrate global significance, and then it's basically development of your presentation. What are the point of views, perspectives you want to take, how are you going to communicate that, how are you going to start, how are you going to transition between ideas, what analytical arguments will you make, and how are you going to conclude everything in the end, what's going to be your final reflective argument. So this kind of visually identifies everything, but it can help you out if you need this as kind of an aid, a visual aid. So the very first thing I typically do with my students is I identify initial brainstorming and case studies. And I have everybody kind of go through the 6 GPCs, what do these look like? What are potential ideas? and what are global significant issues related to these topics. And once we do that, I typically ask them to choose one or two that they're really interested in right away. And typically, a few might be easier to deal with, considering if you're going through the course unit by unit. If you're doing it that way, you'll be in Unit 1, Power, Sovereignty, International Relations. And a lot more topics might lend themselves better to that in terms of environment, poverty, health, identity, border security. If you do Unit 3 later on in the course, students might not get enough content by that point, or they might be doing independent research. So, like I said, certain GPCs might be easier to work with. And there are kind of two approaches for determining how you want to do this topic, or how you want to develop your political issue. You can start out with a GPC focus and then research varying case studies based off of a concept within that global political challenge. Or if you have a case study in mind that is occurring, then you can kind of develop and work it into a GPC, and then develop your political issue based off of that later on. There's no real right 100% way of doing this. It's kind of up to you. But in the end, the clear thing that needs to come about from all of your brainstorming is the development of a very clear and functioning political issue. That's your central idea that the whole entire presentation is going to be around. It is going to be your research question. It is going to be your primary focus. Your analytical arguments are going to come out based off of this political issue. Anything you research is going to come back to this major problem that you've identified. And if it's not clear, it's going to be a very difficult process. So the brainstorming stage is very important for you, and that political issue is going to be very central to everything that you do. These are words from the IB that came directly from one of the most recent examiner reports. With the GPC, students are encouraged to identify case studies that are more local in origin, with an eye towards using the presentation to analyze the case study within a wider context of global politics. Consider the local issues. They can be more important to the student's daily life and lend themselves to more focused presentation, not to mention interesting. Further, many, not all, topics picked from the candidates' headlines of various news outlets prove rather unwieldy for many, not all candidates. So a case study is kind of that prime example of this issue occurring in a very kind of local, community-based focus. I always tell my students that this is kind of the focal point for the whole entire argument. It's something that you can always come back to in terms of your analysis, but it is kind of that almost shining star example of this issue occurring. However, you need to be able to expand that to a global significance discussion. So remember, you're not treating this case study in isolation of the whole entire argument. You're using it as kind of a shining star example of everything that is coming about from this political issue. So once you kind of get your GPC and your case study identified, you definitely want to clarify that political issue. And political issues are very complex ideas. They're the driving force for the whole presentation. Like I said, they clarify research, provide a context for the discussion, and it takes time. Don't be frustrated if your first draft of political issues aren't really that clear. It takes time to really learn how to develop them appropriately, and they're very complex things. However, they're very concise. I always tell my students your political issue is the statement that you would tell somebody if they were saying, "What is your topic about? What are you doing? I don't understand. What is this presentation about?" If you had to explain it in like a sentence clearly, that would be, in a sense, what your political issue would be. Things to focus on when creating political issues: who gets what? When does this happen? How does this happen? These are examples, sample topics from GPC presentations from the IB. This comes directly from the subject guide. These are environment topics. And if you notice, what we have is kind of a case study identified, and then we have the political issue kind of identified as well. I like this one down here, shale gas production in the United States. That would be the case study of the topic. And overall, what's the political issue? The influence of environmental NGOs on congressional decision making. That's going to be your focus. This is going to be everything you're kind of identifying here. And you're using this case study to discuss this in context of an actual real world application. With this topic, I would expect students to expand this to be a global issue, that congressional decision making, the influence that environmental NGOs can have global significance on congressional decision making as well. Here are identity topics as well. These could potentially be really interesting for students. Race incarceration in the United States. What are the reasons for and the effects of racial profiling in American policing? Once again, that would be something you would expand to a global significance. But these are possible ideas to help you out. Okay, at this point, I think the next thing that you need to understand is how do you actually formulate and put everything into focus? How do you actually do the HL presentation? What are the requirements for it? And how do you structure it? So actually, I'm going to have a separate video for that. So take a look at that, and hopefully your HL presentations are amazing. All right, goodbye.